Ever since the rework, Persephone is probably the most discussed god in Smite. There are some people who absolutely love her, and some people who absolutely hate her state right now. Ahoy, my name is Duke, and in today's video we'll talk about Persephone's state of balance and how we can potentially balance her. In order to do that, we first have to find out how her actual balance is right now. Because if we go by community perception or my comment section, then she is simultaneously completely trash and useless, and also absolutely overpowered and broken. And it would be kind of hard to balance around both. Fortunately, all of the games are recorded on normal.casualsmite.com, so we can actually see quite well how she is doing in different modes. Beginning with Arena here, we can see that her win rate went up quite a lot, but her win rate wasn't the worst beforehand as well. She is now at 54.15% win rate and in the 9th spot. If we look at her stats overall here, we also see a lot more green. Her KDA went up by a lot, so she's definitely been improving in Arena. I think that's especially because her kit requires less setup now than it used to, and Arena isn't exactly a place that has a lot of time span or downtime in between where you can set up very well in the first place. At the same time, you're also not moving around too much in Arena, so it's not like you constantly have to reset your entire plant field, because you'll probably have some left, so that probably explains why her win rate wasn't terrible before either. In Assault, her win rate went up a fair bit as well to 53.74%. I am not quite sure what exactly the cause for her being significantly lower here is. Maybe it's just because healers are so strong in Assault that she still can't quite reach the top there. There are also some other guards that benefit a little bit more from the area being a single line, so that will probably be a factor too. In Joust, her win rate went up a lot. She's at almost 57% win rate here, and the second best god right now, also the second most popular. I think the big factor here is the fact that you can hardly avoid her plants when she sends them out, since there is a lot less space to move around in. There are also a lot of walls that you can utilize in various ways, so I expect her win rate to actually drop a little bit once we switch to the classic Joust map, which is going to happen soon. In Clash, she's also doing pretty well with a 53.56% win rate and is in spot number 8. Her damage increase here with 4000 more damage is also pretty massive. And I guess overall maybe similar rules to Arena apply, plus some additional wall areas that help her as well. In Siege, her win rate is 55% and she is the 3rd highest winning god. Again, a map with relatively tight lanes and also a lot of walls for her to utilize, a pretty big jungle, so there are a lot of advantages coming from that. And that brings us to the main attraction, Conquest. Here, her win rate is at 52.82%, which puts her in spot number 11, but it's also worth pointing out that her win rate went up by 99 spots. We also see a 2 kill increase, we see a 4300 damage increase, and even in the self-heal department we see a reasonable increase of 999. This is probably from Soul Gem as well as from her plants just being higher in numbers, so that she can utilize more self-healing from the plants at times. We even see quite a significant increase in her gold per minute by 48, which is obviously partially due to a higher win rate, meaning you are often more in a situation to get more gold, but also from her passive generally being able to generate gold better, as it's no longer used for survivability or anything, but just for gold gain. Now, what we normally have to keep in mind with new guard releases is that they will often be in mirror matches, which is usually a big problem for their statistics, because obviously the win rate will be closer to 50% if one of the players is losing and the other one is winning on the same guard. That doesn't seem to be a problem for Persephone specifically, based on what we can see here, because she's only 4th in popularity. That is obviously still high, but it means that she wasn't in constant mirror matches. Gilgamesh, Athena and King Arthur are all more popular, with Gilgamesh almost being twice as popular. Other mages are also not that far behind her. Anubis was actually picked almost as much as her as well. I played it quite a bit to test her out, and I barely ran into any actual mirror matches. So I think, sure, there is some influence from that, but I don't think the influence will drastically skew the stats here. Maybe her win rate would be like 0.5% higher overall or something. That said, she still has a very high win rate, especially for casual conquest. What you have to keep in mind is that this factors in every player who picks this god. And that also includes extremely new or not very good players. The question is how much of a factor this is for her overall performance, because while she used to be very complex to play, that is no longer the case. A new player can now pick up Persephone and likely do okay. If we look at the stats for new players only here, you can see that her win rate here is actually pretty good. The problem is we don't know how many Smurfs are included here that just outright board Persephone just to frag some new players. So it's always a bit hard to judge for these types of characters. But either way, I think even inexperienced players can do decent on her now, and that was a part of the goal of the rework. Now, in order to understand what this data really means, we have to know what the guards above her are. Here's a quick overview of the guards, and what you can see is, while this doesn't apply for all of them, a lot of these are stomper guards that just frag very well against more inexperienced players that don't know how to counter them. Only a few guards here would find the same level of value in competitive. And in that context, I also watched Veneno's first impression on her, him being a pro player. And what I thought was very interesting was that he found her very frustrating in many ways. Partially, this made a lot of sense because he was very much playing her like old Persephone, and in many ways that doesn't work anymore, whereas a player that jumps into the new Persephone right away won't really face the same issues. They're not really used to the same combos, the same muscle memory and everything else. But he did point out some significant flaws that she would likely encounter against coordinated teams, where her self-peel is relatively limited. She doesn't really have the quick response in some situations that she used to have, and that is something that you kind of need to be aware of. You need to play her very, very differently. I don't think that will inherently make her bad or unviable on higher levels of play, but I do think it will make for a very different playstyle that players need to get used to, and that players will also have to find new responses to. But with her generally performing so well, it does seem like she's at least a little bit above the point of balance, in my opinion. And Hi-Rez agrees. That's why in the bonus update, they are nerfing the damage of the Harvest Flowers Bite from 50% scaling to 40%. Hi-Rez also acknowledged that her problems don't quite end at that point. So one of the things that I think is really frustrating at the moment is the inconsistency of the plants themselves when biting. Sometimes they will not bite targets that are very close, not bite targets behind them, and then feel relatively weak, but in other moments, when you chase down an enemy, they will bite them continuously and do very high amounts of damage. I think there needs to be a little bit more of a middle ground here. While learning to not walk backwards with the plants is obviously something that players have to figure out, I do believe that the intervals between bites could be a little different. The first bite could happen immediately and be guaranteed on the target that gets in range, and then afterwards the secondary or third bite should be a fair bit slower, so that you actually have more time to get out of the radius, even when you're running away from a Persephone and her flowers are chasing you. That would also help prevent her from being overly snowbally, where when she's able to rush down enemies, she puts so much more pressure on them. That may effectively have a similar impact to another scaling reduction, but with a more consistent result. Additionally, she also has that extremely lackluster passive. Her new passive kind of makes sense with her old kit, when placing flowers was more of a thing that you could do over time, but now it hardly makes sense to use the passive at all. You cannot see what's going on the map while you do it, so you're kind of losing some information, and you also will be losing 3 of the flowers you place the second that you use your 2 after you get out of your death state, and usually you want to use that somewhere. It's also weird that the passive is not consistent with the 2, because you can always place 6 seeds, whereas with the 2 you actually are limited to 5 plants initially anyways, and then towards the end of the game you have 7 seeds, but you can't even put down 7 seeds while in the passive. Doesn't really matter much because again they get overwritten by the 2 immediately anyways, but if they didn't, then it would still be kind of weird. Somewhat of a temporary solution would be to make the 6 plants from her passive not count towards the total plant count. They're essentially ghost plants that can be used and kind of reward you a little bit for dying, I suppose. That is one option, but I feel like that could also be abused in some ways. Maybe you could stack them around Fire Giant every time you die or something, but at least they would have more value than they do right now. In the long run, they could look at something else to make the passive more interesting, even though it doesn't necessarily have to be dealing damage after death again. Additionally, I also think that her scalings are currently extremely high. We saw that her damage values went up significantly in pretty much every mode, which again is not entirely surprising because she is just easier to play. But I think her scalings factor into this, and I've heard quite a few people say that she feels like she has a lot of one-shot potential in late game, or a lot of burst combo potential. That makes sense because her 1 has 90% scaling on a 10 seconds cooldown, and her 2 also has 80% scaling, plus whatever extra damage you can get from the 40% scaling from the bite. Not that many other mages have access to 2 ranged safe abilities with this amount of scaling, while also having a damaging escape along with that, and still okay damage at least on the ult, and a lot of impact on the ult anyways. I think especially if the passive gets some buffs, then we might see some scaling cuts on the 1 or 2, just like 5-10%, nothing crazy, but just some slight reductions in those places. And then of course we'll have to see how she performs on different levels of play now, because the impact could be drastically different there, and the issue might be for Hi-Rez that maybe she ran into a situation now where she's much stronger on lower levels, but doesn't bring the same performance on the highest level, but that we'll have to find out later. I will of course keep you updated about any future developments in this regard, so if you want to stay updated for that, or hear about the other items of this patch that we haven't talked about yet, or Morgan Le Fay, then click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at my home gym and contemplate if it's harder for me to find the time to work out, or for you to... Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible, that is Thatnik Walker, Dwayne Brennan, Lenta25 Green, Zalaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Z Ferroli, and everyone else you see here.